All right, let's dive into one of Hamlet's most thought-provoking scenes. Act 4, Scene 4. We're going to break down this pivotal moment and give you some serious ammo for those classroom discussions. Consider this your study guide, folks.
You'll want to pay attention to this one. Because Act 4, Scene 4, it's where Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy comes to life. He comes face to face with a character who's all about action, you know?
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about the scene where Hamlet runs into Fortinbras' army on their way to Poland. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, why is a pointless military campaign so important?
Good question. It's not really about the land at all. It's more about what this whole situation reveals about honor. Back in Shakespeare's time, Fortinbras risks everything, his men, resources, for a tiny, almost worthless piece of territory.
Yeah, the captain even says something like, what was it, 5 ducats, I wouldn't farm it.
Exactly. So why would Fortinbras go to all this trouble? Now, this is a question that's likely to come up in class, so think about it in terms of honor. What it meant to people in Elizabethan England. It was all about reputation, social standing, and duty. Fortinbras had to follow through on his father's ambition to conquer this land, no matter how insignificant.
Okay, I see. So how does this all tie back to Hamlet?
Well, imagine this. Hamlet, who's been agonizing over his own inaction, he suddenly sees Fortinbras, a man of action, marching off to war.
And this is where that famous soliloquy comes in, right? The one where Hamlet's like, what is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed a beast? No more. He compares himself to a beast.
Exactly. This encounter forces him to confront his own, procrastination and indecision. He even points to Fortinbras as a model of decisive action. Though whether that action is actually wise, that's another question entirely. It's a moment of intense self-criticism for Hamlet and frustration.
So, for those of you taking notes, potential exam question, how does the contrast between Hamlet and Fortinbras illuminate the themes of action versus inaction in the play?
And remember, the to be or not to be soliloquy, it's not just about suicide. It's about these bigger questions like, what does it mean to be human? What's our purpose? Is it better to suffer in silence or take action against injustice?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the dramatic language
Yeah.
and miss the deeper philosophical questions that Shakespeare is raising.
Right. And think about the imagery that Shakespeare uses of disease and decay to emphasize the corruption that Hamlet sees all around him in the court.
It's like he's infected, right, by his own inaction.
Exactly. He sees himself as part of the problem, unable to, take the necessary action to cleanse the kingdom. And seeing Fortinbras marching with such, conviction, it throws his own paralysis into sharp relief. If we look closer at the text, you'll notice Hamlet doesn't just admire Fortinbras's action. He's also critical of it.
Oh.
Yeah. Remember that line about a delicate and tender prince driven by divine ambition? There's some irony there. It's almost like he's questioning, if all that ambition is misplaced, especially for what they're fighting for.
I see. So it's not a simple case of Fortinbras being like the good example of action
Yeah.
and Hamlet the bad example of inaction.
Right. Shakespeare's always more complex than that. He wants us to really think about these things, the motivations behind actions, the consequences. Is Fortinbras really honorable, or is he just blindly following orders?
That's a good point. That could lead to a lively debate in class.
Definitely.
Oh.
And don't forget about the symbolism. Shakespeare uses a lot of it in this scene. The eggshell that Hamlet mentions, that worthless piece of land. It's a powerful metaphor. The fleeting nature of human ambition.
It's like he's saying all this fighting and bloodshed, it's all meaningless.
Exactly. It all ties back into the themes of mortality, the futility of worldly pursuits. These ideas run throughout Hamlet. Shakespeare was grappling with these ideas, and he wants us to grapple with them too.
Now, for all the students out there getting ready for exams, here's a question for you. What is the dramatic purpose of this scene? Why interrupt the main plot with this random encounter?
Oh, it's brilliant. Shakespeare's really smart. It forces us and Hamlet to step outside the court. Consider the larger world. Up to this point, Hamlet's been so consumed by his own dilemma.
Right, revenge and the corruption in the court. He's lost sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah. This encounter with Fortinbras, it jolts him out of that introspective paralysis, forces him to confront his inaction on a grander scale. It also foreshadows his eventual return to Denmark with a newfound resolve. Although, that resolve is still tinged with doubt and melancholy.
So almost like Fortinbras is a catalyst for Hamlet's development, even though they only share this one short scene.
Exactly. It's another literary device Shakespeare uses masterfully, the foil.
Right. Fortinbras, with all that decisiveness, whether you admire it or question it, it highlights Hamlet's procrastination and that internal conflict. Classic case of using contrast to illuminate character.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the language. Shakespeare really brings this scene to life. There's a lot to unpack here. From the imagery of disease and decay to the philosophical thoughts on life and death. In Hamlet's soliloquy.
And the contrast between the verse and prose.
Oh, absolutely. That's something your teacher might ask you about.
For sure.
Notice how Hamlet's soliloquy is written in verse, reflecting his introspective, philosophical state of mind. But then when he talks to the captain, it's straightforward prose. It emphasizes the practicality of the situation.
It's these subtle choices that make Shakespeare a genius, don't they?
Yeah.
They add so many layers of meaning, create a dynamic experience.
And imagine being an audience member back then, watching this on stage. The marching army and then Hamlet.
Wow.
Alone.
Wow, yeah. Powerful.
It would have driven home those themes, action versus inaction.
Totally.
We have to remember Shakespeare wrote these plays to be performed, not just read.
Right. So, if you really want to get the most out of this scene, read it out loud. Maybe even act it out with a friend.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It'll help you appreciate all those nuances of the language, the dramatic impact of the scene.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about one of the most crucial parts of Act 4, Scene 4.
Okay.
Hamlet's transformation. So we talked about Fortinbras being a foil to Hamlet.
Yeah.
But does this scene, how does it change Hamlet? Like, what happens inside?
Yeah, it's subtle, but it's there. You can see it, the seeds of change. This meeting with Fortinbras and the army, it's a turning point for Hamlet. He's been so stuck in his own head with all these anxieties, he hasn't been able to move forward.
Right, he's been so focused on, his own thoughts that he can't take action. And then he sees Fortinbras just taking charge.
Exactly. Even if it's for a meaningless cause, It forces Hamlet to look at himself and his inaction.
Yeah.
It's a wake-up call. He doesn't suddenly change into this man of action, but he starts moving in that direction, Remember, right after this scene, he gets on the ship to England. And, well, he doesn't know it yet, but that journey, it sets in motion the end of the play.
And this is where things get really interesting. For classroom discussions, does Hamlet really change? Or is it all just fate?
That's a great question, and one that scholars have been debating forever. There's no easy answer. But what we do know is that Act 4, Scene 4, this is a huge moment for Hamlet. It marks a shift from just thinking to actually doing, even if that action is, hesitant.
Okay. So when you reread this scene, pay attention to how Hamlet's words change after this. See how his soliloquies, they become less about thinking and more about doing.
Yeah, good point. And think about how this scene connects to the bigger themes. We talked about honor, action versus inaction, mortality, but there's also revenge. How does this meeting with Fortinbras, how does it affect Hamlet's desire to avenge his father?
Wow. These are tough questions. but they're the kind that will really impress your teacher. So, take notes.
Before we finish up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've been looking at this scene, from a literary point of view. But it's important to remember that Hamlet is more than just words on a page. It's a story about people with all their faults, their passions, their struggles.
Right. It's a story that we still connect with today because it deals with these big questions. Loss, betrayal, trying to find meaning. We've all been there.
Exactly. So when you're reading Hamlet, don't just focus on the academic side of things. Let yourself be moved by the story, by the characters, by the beauty of Shakespeare's words.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, that's what makes it so timeless. It speaks to us,
Yeah.
to our hearts as much as to our minds.
Well said. So keep those deep dives going and let us know if there are other parts of Hamlet you want to explore.
Until next time.